We're now going to do a brief overview of project methodologies, but these are really frameworks that give you a broad understanding of how to put together a change project, but as a framework lacks all of the details to be a true methodology. Collectively, there's 28 different models I've identified that fit this category, but we're just going to go at a very high level, introducing basically some of them at an elementary level, and we'll go into more detail in a separate course into a few of them. Moving forward then, let's take a look at this traditional chart here that you've seen before. We're now talking about the project framework at a high level, and diagnostic models, individual change models, and foundational models are really subservient or used within the project framework itself. So we're looking at a very high level of how change projects are planned. Going forward then for methodology. This is not a methodology but a framework, as I said, in which case you can, with some experience, use it as what to do, but it's more of the things that people recommend as desirable in doing, and as a result, not all of the minor issues will be involved. These work well for an intermediate to an experienced practitioner, but a novice practitioner may find them somewhat lacking because it doesn't have all of the individual detail. The framework then are mostly recommended practices, and gaps will exist if you try to use it as a true methodology of a checklist of what to do. Then, is there a true project methodology? Truthfully, I have not found one. What I have done was synthesize one from several frameworks, and that's what I do recommend, is use several frameworks and figure out what works for you and that particular situation, because every change situation is unique. Default methodology. Everybody has a default methodology of what they do, but too often this is what should not be done, and it's based upon what people have seen others do before, which again is generally what not to do, because there's more failure of success than really success itself. So first off, generally what triggers the change project is some symptom, and too often we rely on the symptom as the focus without getting to the underlying core problem. Some stability is assumed as being normal, and the symptoms are disrupting that stability. Moving forward then, there's a search for solutions, which is your change objective. Too often these solutions are predetermined by the management of what they would like to do, or the first feasible solution to the symptom. We are generally underestimating the complexity or the interconnection of the true problem itself. Third then is a gap clarification. This is a traditional approach of identifying a present state or clarifying the present state, identifying a future state, and then closing the gap. This is determining what needs to happen. Too often, though, we ignore in the default methodology what should be protected from the change. We focus too much on the change, not what should be protected as being core to the organization's values and the way they do business, and as a result, that often is the area of resistance. Fourth then is the change plan. Again, too often is low on involvement. We generally like to use a telling approach, telling someone what to do. We recognize that the telling approach isn't really feasible, so they default to a selling approach. This really ignores the three higher levels of involvement itself that we'll talk about separately. Fifth then is resistance is really expected but not planned for. Often it's an excuse of failure, in which case the team that is planning the change can use resistance as an excuse for what they failed to do themselves. This is handled in detail in the change resistance set of lectures. Moving forward then to traditional change frameworks. Again, I identified at least 28 of these and I'm wanting to focus on some of the key ones now. First is pro-size ADKAR. This is really an individual change model that's applied to organizations, but it really fits as a change for individuals themselves. But because organizational change is a collective process of individuals choosing to change, it makes some sense here, but there's better frameworks. The LCCA, the Listen, Communicate, Collaborate, Activate, is a 4-step but very high level, in which case these are the 4 things that you have to do, but it obviously leaves out a lot of the detail of what needs to be done also. The CAP, this is from General Electric during the Jack Welch era, and it is very popular as a change accelerator. It focuses on strategic change using a nonlinear model, in which case it's one of the more advanced from that aspect in that it looks at all the dynamics of an organization. It focuses on leadership, the shared need, the vision, how to mobilize the change, how to embed the change in the organization culturally, as well as how to monitor progress. The Kotter model is probably the one that is most often taught in college courses. This is an 8-stage model that's published in his book, Leading Change. There is 8 stages. First is determining urgency, or getting the organization to recognize that there is a need for change and building some really movement for action beyond just awareness itself. Second is building a guiding coalition. Who needs to be involved in the change process? Third is what is the change vision and the strategy for that change vision. This is a key part of the effort, in which case it's a leadership of vision, not a management of change per se. Fourth then is the communication of that change vision. Critical, particularly since the organization as a rule, there's only pockets of people that understand the problem itself. Fifth then is empowering broad action. It's not just a leadership team doing action, but it's getting involvement across the organization. But again, it's more of a selling level of involvement, maybe a little bit of testing, but not much higher involvement than that. Sixth then is generating the short-term wins. This is an activity to show that progress is being made, get some laggards on board, and keep some energy behind the change process moving. Seventh then is how to coordinate and consolidate those wins and start to embed them into the culture itself to produce more change. This is a recognition that change is not a single initiative, but really a series of interconnected initiatives, and this starts to make those connections. Eighth then is really anchoring it into the culture, into the organization, such that it becomes a habit versus something that people are consciously aware of having to do. This is the Kotter 8-stage model. And again, one of the more popular ones, least taught in college courses. The traditional methodology then. This is hard to say because they're often internal to consultants, or a synthesis similar to what I've done that is done at an organizational level, such that each organization has a basic approach of how they do change at the local level. There's also the default, which is the default we talked about before, which is based upon observational learning. Again, a very poor approach because it is often based upon what not to do. The cross-synthesis is really taking the Kotters and a couple other change frameworks to put together a single change RX, is what I call it, for what could be done. As a result, I've tried to merge different perspectives of a change framework to close some of the gaps that each has individually. There's a copy of this framework following this particular lecture. So, which framework should you use? It really comes down to a personal preference, but also an organizational familiarity. So if your organization has been using CAP for years, it's probably best to stay with that because people are aware of that process and know about the terminology and can easily use it. But again, it really becomes one of preference and familiarity. But be aware that all frameworks have gaps when you use the methodology. For people who are intermediate and expert levels, not a problem. For novices, though, I highly recommend that you use multiple frameworks to see how to combine them so that you don't overlook a possible step. So any methodology, though, also needs to be customized to the situation. There's no one process that fits everything. Every change initiative is somewhat unique. And this is where the frameworks do come in handy because it gives you a high-level overview of some of the things you need to consider and not overlook. But again, be aware that these methodologies or frameworks are designed for episodic change. They're not a good model for continuous adaptive change that we're facing nowadays. New models are being generated for those situations that are covered in a separate course. So be aware that these are project, episodic, single, and change initiatives. So going forward then, next step is gaining some familiarity of the different models, figuring out which works best for you, and possibly how to synthesize different frameworks into a methodology that you can use.